Hello, friends, and welcome to the April 26th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Adnip, your host and Texas Impact's Engagement Director, and today's episode is brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas. And y'all, I feel like after the last week, I have to start today with a quick word of encouragement. We used to have a segment on Weekly Witness called A Moment of Hope, and I feel like maybe even before the weekly word today, we need that moment of hope. Y'all, the last few weeks in the Texas legislature have been hard. It seems like every week, more harmful pieces of legislation take a step forward in the process, and another good bill or a good amendment takes a step back. But friends, the next few weeks are still critical because as of now, nothing has passed all the way to completion. And so we have to keep doing the work as people of faith. So during the legislative update and action alert, Josh is going to say some things. We're going to hear some things that might seem kind of dark. But again, we have to keep the faith, we have to keep hope and continue doing the work until the end of the legislative session. There are 34 days left in session, and we have to keep doing the work to close out strong. So we'll go those 34 days. We're going to work as hard as we can, and then I promise we'll take a week or two break before we continue the long-term work to continue to work for a more just and equitable Texas. This is a long-term project that we're working on. So 34 days, quick break, and then continue that work for the long term. And I just want to say, y'all are doing great. And I find so much hope every time I open up and see how many telephone calls you've made. Every time I open my email and see the meetings that you've been having, you are doing incredible work. And I just want to start out today by encouraging you to keep doing that over the course of the next few weeks. Have the meetings, make the calls, and most importantly, find some friends to join you in this long-term project of democracy. So that aside at the beginning, on to today's program. We've changed up our topic of the week this week based on what happened in the legislature last week. So today, we're going to be focusing on Medicaid with our good friend Ann Dunkelberg from Every Texan, before we close it out with our legislative update and action alert with Josh Houston. But before all of that, I am honored to welcome to the conversation a good friend, a former colleague and Texas Impact board member, Reverend Krystal Leedy, who is one of my personal favorite pastors and good friend for this week's Weekly Word. So Reverend Krystal Leedy, take it away.
Well, good afternoon, y'all. I'm just going to jump right in, so I hope that y'all are along for the ride. You know, whenever I think about the role of religion in our society and in our community and in our state, I have to think about what in the world is its purpose. I think it's about more than just a bunch of nice people getting together. And the rituals that we do mean something, and they mean something more than just having a mid-morning Sunday snack or singing a song together in a group, which I now realize is a really strange thing. Where else do we get together to sing a song in a group? But I digress. The role of religion in society is meaning making, especially in places where the world seems meaningless. It's saying something about God. It's saying something about us and our relationship to God. It's saying something about us and our relationship to other people. And it does so in a ritualized way because that's how we get these messages into our bones. It's hard for me right now to see a loaf of bread and a cup of wine without thinking of a gathering with friends, a joyful feast of the people of God mixed with the solemnity of the death and resurrection that we are continually living into. It's hard for me not to see the faces of the people that I have served. We are constantly making meaning out of ordinary things. I'm getting my second COVID-19 vaccine tomorrow, and I'm really, really thrilled about it. It seems like this little tiny shot is going to do so much to be able to bring us back into the communities that we love. I'm hopeful because of medical science, and I'm hopeful because creative people got down to business and worked hard to bring about a vaccine that will save people's lives. I had a friend and colleague ask if anyone had a prayer for the receiving of the COVID-19 vaccine because her parishioners wanted to make meaning out of the occasion. Of course they did. That's what religious people do. They want to make meaning out of this seemingly meaningless world. And we often do this in ritualized action like prayer. So it's difficult for me to hear about another institution that bends toward ritual action and symbols, namely the government, that it seems like from my perspective, they cannot sometimes see the meaning that they are making out in the world. Healthcare in our country is not great. Having worked as a hospital chaplain for a bit, watching people die, watching the exhaustion of the healthcare workers, and even then, and I can't imagine what hospitals are experiencing now. Hospitals are another place of ritualized action, another place where what you wear is important, how you speak is important, what you say is extremely important. And it's almost as if our communal spaces, places like faith communities and medical offices and Capitol buildings, all contain ritualized action because they are places of life and death and the need to rein in the chaos. They are places where communities gather, where people hopefully have voice, where decisions are made that affect people's lives. They are meaning-making places. So I get concerned when we forget to reflect on the meaning that we are making. And the best way to reflect on that meaning is to listen to the stories of other people. So hearing about $14 Tylenol at the hospital and the cost of prescription drugs and the lack of using federal funds for Medicaid expansion in Texas, they're all numbers. And frankly, they're not as meaningful to me as a mother who can't afford to go to the doctor, or creditors that keep calling a man incessantly to get their money, or doctors that can't provide care to rural areas because their hospitals are closing. Meaning-making spaces are about people. They always have been. Complex characters that are seeking happiness and trying to alleviate suffering. People who are journeying together for a moment, having their stories written on one another's pages. Human beings who need one another and who are asking for help and hope and are hopefully receiving it through the work of creative people in power who have not lost their imaginations for meaning making and who have not lost the ability to do some introspection and think about what might happen to people when they make some sort of proclamation. In every single prayer, with every single diagnosis, with every law written, there is a human being that will be affected. There is more than just eyes and lungs and brains that will be affected. There is a life, a being, a person that stands to gain or lose from the words that we proclaim. So I want to call upon all meaning makers today to live into your creativity, to imagine a better and happier community. So join me in prayer if you would. A prayer that I wrote for a friend and for myself as we as a society receive our vaccines, which are shots of hope, thanks to medical science and the creativity that comes from our Creator. Let us pray. God, help me to receive today. Help me to receive your abounding love, which is ever present in the creative community. A community of artists and makers, weavers and poets, explorers and scientists. May I receive today a created vaccine that comes from your creative work in the world. May I receive the good work of your creative partners, giving you all the glory for this gift and gratitude to the people who made it possible. May I receive this gift and may I rest from all labor, allowing the beauty of this vaccine to protect my body and bodies around me from harm. And after this receiving full of gratitude, God, may I give my creativity for your glory, building a better community, full of hope for tomorrow. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Krystal. Now, full disclosure, I'm not usually in the practice of asking follow-up questions after our weekly word, but since you're a former colleague and friend, I do have one for you. So one of the projects you worked on while you were with Texas Impact was a document called HEAL. And I wonder, based on the conversation, based on your weekly word and the conversation we're about to have with Ann, I think it'd be a great resource for congregations and people to check out. I'll just say, if you search for Texas Impact HEAL, HEAL, it'll pop up. But do you want to say a word about that resource?
Yeah, HEAL was written as a liturgical guide. So these are prayers and sermon starters and all kinds of things that people can use in worship services if you want, and then also for your own personal devotion to, once again, make meaning out of what's happening, particularly with Medicaid expansion, but there's also resources in there about like general healing and what that means for us as a society and how we can look at that through a faith lens. So I encourage you to check it out. I'm pretty fond of it, but I hope that faith communities can use that to just start a discussion about how important it is to be a faith community that's at the center of their community, of their larger community.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it is an incredible resource. And so I hope people will check that out. And Josh is going to talk about some dark news later in session about how things aren't going all that great. But even if things were going wonderfully, my guess is that congregations will still would still be needing to have conversations about the importance of healthcare and expanding health coverage even after these next 34 days are over. So great resource for congregations to have those conversations in times of prayer, and really appreciate the work you have done on that and for joining us this morning. Krystal, thanks for everything.
Yeah, thank you, Scott.
All right. Next, we will welcome to the conversation one of my other favorite Weekly Witness guests from months and years past, Ann Dunkelberg, who's the Associate Director and Program Director for the Health and Wellness Team at Every Texan. Ann, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here.
So we did shift our topics. We were supposed to be talking about something else and decided that it was really important to have a conversation about Medicaid this week. And you are the perfect person to have that conversation with. So thanks again for jumping in with us kind of last minute. So I hope I'll lay the groundwork appropriately. You can correct me if you need to clean this up. But I think it's fair to say that because Texas has yet to expand Medicaid, and the state has been receiving federal health funds through an 1115 waiver to cover uncompensated care for hospitals and other innovative health projects for low-income Texas and mental health services and much more. The Trump administration had approved a new 1115 waiver, but about 10 days ago, the Biden administration rescinded that agreement, meaning that Texas is going to need to find a new solution prior to that waiver expiring in 22. So first of all, make sure I got all that right. But second, what does that decision mean for Texas and what comes next?
Well, we do have to spend more time than you would like sort of correcting the misimpressions that have been put out there. So the first thing to understand is that the state asked for an extension of our existing complicated agreement with the feds, and they submitted that in late November. That was not a whole new waiver. There were actually only some moderate changes to it. And so the decision that the Biden administration made to withdraw the approval that the Trump administration made is not ending the waiver. So that's been, a lot of the headlines have misrepresented that. So we're going to try to fill in kind of what did happen and then more importantly, what does this mean? Because this is a classic example of some super complicated stuff about Medicaid that we don't, I don't want everyone's head to have to hurt over how complicated you get. But on the other hand, it has the potential to hide really important stuff that affects individual people's lives. So the first thing to understand is the state submitted this extension request way earlier than you would normally do that. And they did that because they were hoping to gain some financial advantages from the Trump administration. Not just that they thought maybe the next administration wouldn't approve, but also because they were afraid some changes in rules about how much money states can get were going to change, and that they might be able to nail down more money under some old rules than they would under the new rules. So they did that. And in the process of doing that, the Trump administration said, oh, go ahead and just fast track this. You don't need to do a public notice and comment period. In fact, the only public notice and comment that Texas Medicaid did was an invitation to join a couple of online meetings after they had already submitted to the Fed. So the skipping of the public notice and comment thing was a big deal in terms of precedent nationally. It was something that people fought for a lot of years to make sure there was actually a legal requirement for public notice and comment. And that includes having an internal process in your state that's supposed to be before you finalize and submit a request. And then after that, there's also a required national comment period so that all the states and anybody can comment on it to the feds and let them know what you think about that. So we didn't do either of those. The other thing that was weird was the Trump administration approved this 5 days before the inauguration. So this was one of those kind of running out the door kinds of things. And interestingly, they approved Texas extension for 10 years, which in the entire history of having these kinds of financial agreements and programmatic agreements with federal Medicaid, they've always been for 5 years. And it's only been in the last few months of the Trump administration that they tried to approve some unusual things and approve them for twice as long as the usual period. So there's a whole area of depth that we will not dive too deep into, but in the same way that, say, the Trump administration approved making people's adults' eligibility for Medicaid conditional on participating and reporting certain kinds of work activities. This is, another area where they kind of went into territory that's arguably not complying with law or practice. And the work requirements is a much more extreme example that's been struck down by the courts. But one of the things that the Biden administration did in January, they put out an executive order, a lot of executive orders, but one of the ones they put out told every state, we're going to be taking a second look at all of these 1115 waivers in your Medicaid programs, and any of them that we think have problems that are actually creating policies that are barriers to the purpose of the Medicaid statute, which is to provide people with health care, we may be revisiting with you. So Texas had that alert, and Texas also had a direct letter a couple of weeks later that every state with one of the waivers got. So we had a lot of notice that they were going to come back to us potentially. And another thing is that if you read some of the cranky, protest kind of comments in the media about this, folks, there were references to it being a $10 billion a year agreement. Well, it wasn't. The amount of money that was actually approved going forward was about $4.4 billion a year. And Texas was hoping to, in addition to what was in that extension that they negotiated with the Trump administration, to also in the future negotiate with the Biden administration a whole separate set of programs that would provide better reimbursement to existing Medicaid providers. And that's where the additional almost $7 billion potentially comes up. So those were not part of their proposal to the Trump administration. They were neither approved nor rejected by the Trump administration, and our state knew that they had yet to be negotiated. So to present that as having been affected by this Biden request is a little disingenuous. So the main thing to understand is the waiver's still here. The waiver will still operate all the way through October of 2022. And to quote the federal Medicaid officials, there's plenty of time for Texas to renegotiate the extension. They'll have to have a public notice and comment process here in Texas and nationally. But it is hyperbole at the very minimum, to suggest that it's all going away and that all of the work that they've done, was for naught. That was a long ramble. I think, one of the most important things is try to figure out what the heck does any of this have to do with Medicaid expansion. I think, let me take a breath and let you ask me the question.
So we did have a question in the chat that I think can also lead to some more conversation. So the question in the chat is, who decides who is able to submit that request for the extension? And so I think that also leads to the question of, if there's no legislative action, like what happens next as they move toward that waiver expiring?
It's a very good question. It is actually only the governor of states that has the authority to submit 1115 waivers and renewals and extensions of those waivers. And in Texas, going back to legislation from 2003, our Medicaid agency, the Health and Human Services Commission, is headed by a CEO who is hired and fired by the governor's office. He doesn't have a governing board, so he really only offers answers to the governor's office. That is not to say that the agency isn't responsive to legislators when they ask him questions, but he is their boss. And so the lines of accountability for this policy really do go very, very directly to the governor's office. Now, so what's going to happen next is presumably Texas will start that renegotiation process with the feds. I would be very surprised if they don't agree with something along the lines of whatever you already had agreed to for 21 and 22, you're golden on that, sort of a safe harbor or hold harmless kind of thing. Because one of the things that does freak hospitals out is, we've already looked ahead to 2022 and we're assuming that we're going to get roughly X amount of money. So I think that that's likely. Another thing to understand, we haven't even touched on this. Scott referred to like innovative projects to improve delivery systems and add more mental health integration into primary care settings and the like. Well, management of chronic diseases like asthma and diabetes. Those are all the other half of the waiver that's not about paying hospitals for free care to the uninsured. That's going away this October. And part of the struggle and the pain of what we're going through right now is that was the most popular part of the waiver for average Texans. The hospitals love getting paid back for free care to the uninsured. And as an advocate, I support us doing that. We have, easily 5.5 million uninsured Texans. Hospitals need some of that support, because of the policy changes that we have made here in Texas. We have more uninsured than we have to. But all of these, fabulous projects that improved access to healthcare, and in some case, and no coverage at all. So this project, going all the way back to 2011, it never provided healthcare coverage to a single Texan. It did, however, provide projects all over Texas. They were very localized and unique to different parts of Texas. And many of them did provide services to uninsured adult Texans, which is who would be affected by Medicaid expansion. And so with that going away, there's nothing to replace that. So the simplest thing I can say about the extension that we're looking at is it only includes the same old uncompensated care pool that we've always had for hospitals, which they have in the last couple of years already let us grow in size. That's not new from the Trump administration. It's been, allowed to grow somewhat over the last few years, and it would add a new little pool by standards for some additional help to local health departments and local authorities for mental health and individuals with intellectual disabilities. So, but it's a much smaller pool. It doesn't do anything else for the uninsured. So one of our challenges is everything that the state skipped over in just planning the process that I sloppily have described to you through this extension was they skipped over any ability for the public to step up and say, where's the coverage? Where is our 90% federal match? Where are the 1.4 million uninsured adult Texans who could be getting not just the ability that if they end up in the emergency room and a hospital takes care of them, for the hospital to get paid back. That's what an uncompensated care pool does. but something that provides them a comprehensive, primary care doctor or other kind of medical home where they can stay healthy, get conditions managed. The emergency room is not going to treat your cancer. It's not going to manage your diabetes. It's not a place for early detection of health problems. And so just from a medical point of view, putting all of our energy into uncompensated care back-end reimbursement pools and nothing into the kinds of things that help low-income working families avoid medical debt. I think we've had an acknowledgement. We have some of the highest medical debt in the country. Both the medical debt and the uninsured potentially in this population are very disproportionately Texans of color. And so there's sort of a structural racism component of our decision not to provide coverage for our lowest income working families. So we're, one of the things that we would really be looking forward to as we go into the new process to have the extension would be, again, a safety net for our hospitals, but let's have that discussion about coverage. And you know what? This is where all you guys come in, because when that process starts, we're going to need lots of people to turn out and raise their voices about this. And I can probably do better on paper, explaining some of the intricacies of this to you than I'm doing out loud. It is like a complicated Venn diagram of overlapping circles. But, the bottom line is we actually did have, the state did do like a survey of all the folks who had been involved all across the state in the delivery system reform projects going all the way back to 2011. And they did that in 2019. And I think, out of something shy of 30 sort of different kinds of groups of folks who weighed in, either all of them or all but one of their primary points was, we need coverage for the uninsured. We need, what are we going to do when delivery system reform goes away? What are we going to do about the uninsured? And when those findings, the state agency staff presented those findings, to the hospitals and other folks who were interested in the waiver. And they noted that this was like a top, if not the top comment. And then they said, but that's up to the legislature. And we have no idea if anybody at the legislature ever saw those findings, if the governor ever saw them, whatever. We have got to make sure that we are holding our elected officials accountable for having this amazing option on the table to improve not just healthcare, but health, for our low-income working Texans.
Yeah, so let's talk about that some, because we'll have opportunities, like you mentioned, to talk to weigh in on the waiver process. But last week, the legislature had a chance to take action, and I think many advocates, myself included, thought that between the 11:15 news and 9 Republicans signing on to a bill that would expand coverage. Many thought that the budget amendment that we talked about, maybe on Weekly Witness last week, I've lost all track of time, but there was a budget amendment last week that would have allowed the governor the power to take those federal dollars to decrease our highest uninsured rate and our highest number of uninsured in the country. That obviously didn't happen last week. So what comes next in the legislative process in terms of trying to expand coverage?
Well, that's a great question. Those of you who may have actually watched the debate on that amendment, it may have jumped out at you, one, that it wasn't a terribly robust discussion. We had a wonderful and eloquent layout by Chairman Garnet Coleman from Houston. And then they were allowed to have one member speak in favor of his amendment and one member speak against it. And Representative Capra-Leon spoke against it, and he stated that one of his primary objections was that it shouldn't be handled through a budget rider, meaning it should have a more robust discussion, which is certainly something we would agree with him on. And I think it really begs the question, are we going to have a hearing on these coverage bills? Scott mentioned the bill that had 4 Republican co-authors and many several additional Republican joint authors. And I think that the question can only go to them about why, if they supported that bill, they voted against this amendment, all but one of them. It was very disappointing. There is, in fact, in terms of the dark things that maybe Josh will tell you more about, there was a rider added to the budget that was not one of the pre-filed amendments, where you could have seen in advance what they were proposing, that moved a lot of money around in the budget, and that appears to be, perhaps part of the what was used to persuade members not to support that amendment. I think that we do not know if we will get a hearing. There's absolutely nothing happening right now to make us think we will get one, but a very, very appropriate message right now to the governor and to the speaker would be, we need a hearing. We need a hearing on this bill. Where's that robust discussion that we were promised?
So we'll have you back on this summer. I just went ahead and locked you in there to talk about future messaging. But for now, you think it's schedule a hearing on the Medicaid expansion bill.
Well, two things, I guess I should never ask you to do two things, and that's why I'm a policy analyst and not an organizer. But I think the organizers would say this is a great time to go through the list of who voted on it. Now, Cover Texas Now, which Texas Impact was one of the founding members of, they will send out an email today that'll have a link to the list of all the votes. And one of the things we are asking people to do is call the folks who voted against them and tell them you're disappointed, and call the folks who voted for it and thank them. So that's a wonderful step to do right now. But in terms of if there's going to be any future in this session, any more progress besides just a sense that the ground is softened. I'd like to leave with more than just a sense that the ground is softened. It would also be excellent to reach out to the governor and the speaker and tell them that that we are expecting a hearing, and certainly based on the speaker and Vice Chairman Caperleon's statement that this deserved a broader discussion.
Yeah, and folks on our rapid response team, you can be expecting emails from us as well today on some messaging around those telephone calls. We certainly need to say thanks to those who voted yes. We certainly need to ask why to those who voted no, especially those joint authors on the expansion bill. So keep your eye on the emails. Go ahead.
The one thing I would want to plug is anybody listening to Weekly Witness, if you found my attempt to explain that whole Medicaid funding piece baffling, go to B. Moorhead's Twitter feed and read her tweet where she edited the governor's statement on the extension. I think it probably will answer every question that you really have. It was a beautiful piece of work.
She was very excited about that. I got a message about the way that was taking off. So absolutely, and you should all be following B on Twitter. And I'm going to give you a second to do shameless plugs, but can I do 2 or 3 rapid fire questions from the chat real quick? Can states have both an 1115 waiver and a Medicaid expansion?
Yeah, 1115 waiver is actually a very broad provision of the Social Security Act. Texas already has 2 1115 waivers. So we could have our existing 1115 we could do Medicaid expansion either as part of that or separately.
So the other 2 questions we have both relate to you and your work. I'll remind folks, Ann is with Every Texan. Some of you might remember the Center for Public Policy Priorities. That's their new name. And so can you give us a couple shameless plugs? Where can we find more information about your work? And how does Every Texan fit into the legislative process is the last question.
Oh my goodness. That is not a short answer, but everytexan.org. I would say go there, go to the blog and go to the recent material and go to the legislative links. I would say that, we had a kind of a reboot of our website, and while there are many wonderful things about that reboot, I would say that those are the 3 places you will see, all of the recent information. So we're working on everything from, better access to the hunger programs, to better access to higher ed, K through 12 education funding, trying to stop the giant tax giveaway to corporations through Chapter 313, which is a really mind-numbing topic, and a whole range of topics. And so, I couldn't possibly do justice to it, but I hope you'll take a look at it. And if you are willing to click a few times, you can eventually find the link to get added to our email list.
Well, Anne, thank you so much for taking the time again, very last minute today. So I'll owe you one there. But really appreciate the work you're doing each and every day on behalf of Texans. So thank you so much for everything. We'll look forward to continuing the conversation post-session. All right, next up, welcoming to the conversation, Josh Houston. And Josh, I hope you were listening during the open. I reminded folks that we do need to have hope and we do need to continue the work over the course of the next few weeks. I wanted to say all of that before you brought us all down. So your legislative update, I took a look at your outline. It made my soul sad. So we're going to start out with some hope. We're going to challenge folks, but go ahead and tell us where we are this legislative session and how the last couple weeks have gone.
Well, we've got less than 40 days to go. What's the exact number, Scott? You got the countdown going. It's
34. I'll give you the hours and minutes when I get back on in a minute.
Yeah, no, we don't need to worry about that. So we're at the point in session where attention is turning to the calendars committee. The House Calendars Committee is the gatekeeper that determines which bills will make it to the floor for consideration by the entire chamber. It's also the gatekeeper where ideas can go to die. That's his job. And so we're now at that point where this rather arcane committee has a great amount of power, and the members on that committee are they've entered center stage, if you like a theater metaphor. And right now they're making this fundamental decision. Is the 87th legislature going to be about addressing the failures of the electric market and reducing racial disparity in policing? Or is it going to be about bullying LGBT kids and restricting the right to vote? That's where we're at. We heard how Medicaid expansion went, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end, but it is in terrible shape. Our optimism is not high on Medicaid expansion because where we're at in the clock. Because let me just say it plainly: if your bill is not out of committee at this point, it is in terrible shape. And all the bills we're about to focus on are bills that are out of committee, at least. And if your bill is over in the other chamber and has cleared one chamber and gotten to the other chamber, it is in very good shape of passing. And so that's the framework that we're operating within. So on the one bookend, you have bills out of committee, and then on the other bookend, you have bills that have about passed one chamber. So let's talk about where we're at with the Texas Impact priorities. Let's start with the climate and more specifically the blackouts and more specifically renewable energy. There is an assault on renewable energy underway. In Senate Bill 3, note the low bill number, Lieutenant Governor's bill, and in Senate Bill 1278, both have passed the Senate and sit over in the House State Affairs Committee. Additionally, the House Companion Bill, which is House Bill 4466, has received a hearing already, which means they don't need to have another public hearing before they pass this bill out and send it to calendars. So this is an extremely critical juncture. What these bills do is they contain provisions that instruct the Public Utility Commission to, frankly, it doesn't say this in the text, of course, but it's a guess. They have no idea. To take a guess at the amount that it costs when wind or solar is not producing. So when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining. Take a guess at that cost and assign that cost to the renewable generators and charge them for it. Which amounts to a giant subsidy for the oil and gas industry, which we will remind everybody had even much more generation tripped offline during the blackout that was oil and gas than was renewable. The renewable got back online quicker as well. What happened is that the electric generators didn't have certain things winterized. valves and things of that nature. They would trip offline. Then the gas producers didn't have electricity to keep things pumping, and their valves froze up and tripped offline. And it became the cycle that nearly led to a system-wide blackout. They were within 4 minutes of having a total blackout that would have taken months to get back online. But we're going to blame renewables, charge them, and subsidize oil and gas. Let's move on to the George Floyd Act and policing. House Bill 88, which is the big thing entitled the George Floyd Act, appears to be dead in committee. Parts of House Bill 88 were broken up and filed as standalone legislation, which is a common legislative tactic. Whenever the whole thing is in trouble, you see what you can move and what the controversial provisions are. So 3 of those 6 bills have reached the calendars committee. None have been set for floor action. 2 of those 3 bills, while they were part of the omnibus George Floyd Act, they were ideas that existed previous to George Floyd. So in other words, they were ideas that were talked about generally as criminal justice reform in previous sessions before we ever had the summer we had last summer. Only one, House Bill 829, would actually be something new in the sense that it creates a progressive disciplinary matrix for when police misconduct occurs. But it does not in any way affect the way that law enforcement and citizens interact with each other. It does not do anything to change the techniques that officers use when they make an arrest, such as those chokeholds that killed Mr. Floyd. Nor do they do anything affecting the duties and powers of police officers. So they're not bad bills, but they are not the reform that advocates have been seeking. The real reform that advocates have been seeking appear to be the very controversial bills that the police unions have locked up in committee at this time. Let's move on to let's move on to hateful LGBT legislation. So I'll remind everybody that 2 years ago, when now Speaker Phelan was chair of the State Affairs Committee, he gave an interview in which he said, and I quote, "We're done talking about bashing on the gay community. It's completely unacceptable in 2019. Now the House, Speaker Phelan's Texas House is on the verge of doing just that, and doing just that to school-aged children that identify as trans. House Bill 1399 by Representative Matt Krause would prohibit doctors from performing medical treatments for gender transitioning, reassignment, or dysphoria. So in other words, teenagers who are currently taking hormone therapies would instantly lose access on September 1 of 2021. House Bill 1399 we're talking about because it passed out of the House Committee on Public Health on a party line vote, and it is in the Calendars Committee, and it is in position to be heard in the next couple of weeks. Let's move on to the right to vote. It is the most important right, preservative of all other rights. Accordingly, the biggest effort, kind of all these things we've talked about, the biggest effort is to erect more barriers to the ballot box. There are 70 bills that have advanced out of committee. Now, not every one of these 70 are bad currently, but any one of these 70 that get to the floor could be dramatically amended on the floor to include a number of very bad provisions, and this happens commonly at the end of session. This is an amazingly large number of bills to watch. They touch and affect every aspect of the election process, from the very beginning with voter registration to the very end on how counted votes get reported out and everything in between. And with so many different bills, with so many different provisions, it has been extremely hard to tell you, member of the public, what these bills do, because they're changing by the hour. So what we have done, we have our action alerts that chronicle many of the most problematic pieces of legislation. We have a couple different links to coalition one-pagers on what SB 7 and House Bill 6 currently do. Senate Bill 7 and House Bill 6 are kind of the marquee bills, if you will, that people are aiming at. And then we additionally have our one pager, which is written flexible enough to respond to the ever-changing provisions. So stay tuned to all those things. The action alerts are on our website. In our legislative update for the week that goes out in the e-news, we have links to all these things. So make sure you're signed up for that e-news, and I'll try to get some of those in the chat box here in a little bit. But all that is kind of where we're at between the bookends of that we were talking about, of out of committee and or over in the other chamber, very much alive and very much of concern. Then, of course, we had what happened on the House floor last Thursday, which was budget night. And the House passed Senate Bill 1, which is their version of the budget, and it'll go to conference committee. And usually budget night goes into the wee hours of Friday morning. It was a relatively short budget night, probably the shortest one I can remember in 15 years of doing this. But of course, the one that was the most dramatic moment and most remarkable moment was the Amendment 54 by Representative Coleman, which would have been the amendment to either expand Medicaid or empower the governor's office to enter negotiations with the federal government about how to draw down that federal money in an acceptable way. We were optimistic about it because of the standalone bill, House Bill 3871, which is the bill we've talked about that's stuck in committee and has not received a hearing. It would have done largely the same thing. House Bill 3871, the night before the hearing, reached 76 co-authors. And just for those of you who may not be, there are 150 members of the Texas House, 76 represents a majority. There are, of course, not 76 Democrats. There are 67 Democrats, which means we had 9 Republican co-authors on this legislation. And it wasn't just us. There were an army of lobbyists that had confirmed that the votes existed as of Wednesday night before it hit the floor. So something happened overnight, and obviously we are working to figure out exactly what happened, and so that you, the voter, can hold those accountable the way that democracy works. We're working to find that out. But overnight, something happened, and when the record vote was taken the next day, 24 hours later, only 1 of those Republicans held. 8 of those 9 Republican co-authors voted against the amendment that did the very thing that the bill would do. And that amendment failed 68 to 80. So to save you the trouble of counting all that up, here are the 8 Republicans that are co-authors that then voted against the amendment. Those are Representatives Steve Allison, Ernest Bales, Travis Clardy, Dan Huberty, Kyle Casal, Stan Lambert, Representative Rainey, and Representative Phil Stevenson. Those are your 8 that were joint authors on a bill and then voted against an amendment that did what their bill would do. So we're not sure what happened, but those are the 8. And then the one to thank is Representative Lyle Larson. And then finally, over in the Senate, new life was breathed into legislation that would permit the unlicensed carry of firearms. We would be regulating how you drive more than how we regulate who carries a deadly weapon. The Lieutenant Governor created a new committee, the Senate Committee on Constitutional Issues. The Senate then suspended the constitutional rule that says no bill may be filed after the first 60 days. In case you're curious, to suspend a constitutional rule, you need a very high threshold that requires the acquiescence of Democrats. And so the Democrats acquiesced and filed, and Senate Bill 2224 was filed, which is authored by Senator Charles Schwartner, the chair of the Committee on Constitutional Issues. And this is another bill that would allow for the unlicensed carry of firearms. The provisions differ from House Bill 1927. Nevertheless, new life is breathed in that issue, and it may be that the Senate intends to pass some sort of constitutional carry provision, and this bill is very much alive in a way that it was not previous to this action taken. So, Scott, that's the end of the wrap up of what happened last week.
Yeah, so just in looking at the action alert for this week, and for those who are with us in the webinar room, I posted that link in the chat. It's kind of clear where we are in session. You'll remember a couple of weeks ago, our action alert might have included telephone numbers of committee members for 8 or 9 or more different committees that we were asking people to call on various issues. And in looking at this week's, it seems like maybe 90% of the telephone calls are to one committee, and that's the House Calendars Committee. And so do you want to say a word about that first section of the action alert that talks about the calls to calendars?
Yeah, that's the critical juncture. So where we're at is there are roughly 3 weeks left to hear House bills. And the bills that are in calendars are right on the verge of hitting the House floor. And it's thought that if several of these bills make it to the House floor, then they get over to the Senate, they're pretty much a done deal. So the Calendars Committee is always your Alamo for a lot of bad legislation. And we have a giant list of bills that are over there. House Bill 1399 is that transphobic bill that we mentioned that would prohibit doctors from performing gender transitioning medical procedures on trans children, taking it away from parents and doctors and imposing their own, belief that they know what's best for you. There's the rest are a couple of very bad voting bills that I do want to mention. They're kind of single shot bills. They are not the great big HB6, SB7 omnibus bills. They are more single shot bills that we need to keep in committee. So House Bill 1725 would prohibit you from hand delivering your mail-in ballot. Many of you did this because we had reason to distrust the Postal Service. Even if we trusted the Postal Service in a normal election year, things happen where the county gets it out late or the mail just messes up, or maybe you just mess up. And the Postal Service tells us that it takes at least a week to guarantee that your ballot arrives. So if your ballot arrives within a week of election day deadline, you can hand deliver it to the county clerk's office currently. This bill would eliminate your ability to do that, which is going to lead to an increase in rejection rates. House Bill 2321 by Representative Jatan. This bill would require signature verification committees to look at signatures from the Department of Public Safety obtained through driver's license data, which sounds innocuous, but if you think about it, they have data that goes back 25 years. My 98-year-old grandfather, I can show you my birthday cards and the evolution of his signature over 25 years. The last time he had a license was 25 years ago. His signature is going to look different. And that means that more likely a signature verification committee is going to reject otherwise perfectly legal and valid votes that based on very old data. And of course, it's not just age, medical conditions and medication can change your signature as well. House Bill 2546 by Representative Jatan would create clerical errors made by a county clerk in the maintenance of the county's voter roll. It would make these clerical errors a felony offense. So if you had 3 or more, they could charge you with a felony for it. There are thousands and thousands of names on a voter roll. It's unclear, how exactly this would be enforced. These are very vague criminal provisions. Is it 3 or more than one time? Is it 3 instances over time? It really empowers the Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General's office to really penalize local elected officials. House Bill 4331 by Representative Jatan would make it a felony on an activity that many of y'all did. We had 25 congregations do Texas Faith Votes and do vote by mail captains, where you distributed vote by mail applications to all of your membership 65 and older. So what this bill would do is it would make you a quote unquote paid vote harvester, whatever that is. But it would make you a felon is the bottom line. So if you distributed applications for ballots by mail, and then you took a position on a ballot measure, something that many nonprofits do, including churches, you would be a felon. So nonprofits, if they're following the law and the Johnson Amendment to the IRS code, we don't endorse candidates, but we can absolutely endorse on ballot measures. Think about Baptist and gambling. Think about the religious right and the hero fights in Houston. Think about Texas Impact and the stuff we worked on, Prop 5, which is the sporting goods tax. We worked on getting water for low-income communities, which was Prop 2. We routinely endorse on constitutional ballot measures. And then there's all the local things that you may care about. If you do that and you distribute applications for ballot by mail, you might, and I say might because it's very badly written, it's vague, you may be a felon. So we oppose this bill as well. We mentioned the George Floyd stuff. We talked about that a little bit in the update. In the action alert are the 4 bills that were part of the larger omnibus House Bill 88 that are moving. They are either in calendars, 3 of them are in calendars, and 1 of them should get to calendars if it's not already there. We're waiting on the committee report, which is a thing to watch, but we have no reason to think the committee report won't make it to calendars. Those 4 bills, HB 829, 830, 831, 834, are all part of the George Floyd Act, and we want them to go. House Bill 1272 by Representative Crockett, this is no-knock warrants. So this was the issue that happened to Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, where the police had the wrong address. The police did not identify themselves. The police just banged down the door in the wee hours of the morning, and her boyfriend thought it was a home invasion, as many red-blooded American males would do. And not knowing it was the police, the boyfriend defended himself and his girlfriend, and the police returned fire and killed Breonna Taylor. This would regulate the use of those no-knock warrants in Texas. We have a couple other good bills. House Bill 1019 by Representative Mesa would simplify the requirements for seniors when they apply or reapply for the supplemental for SNAP food stamps. Helps to address senior hunger in Texas. House Bill 1382 by Representative Busey is a good bill that actually would make elections more secure in Texas. It would establish an online tracking system for mail-in applications and ballots. So it would make ballots like any package you get from Amazon or UPS, where you can track it and find out where it's at in the process. Currently, there's no provision for this in Texas. Several counties did it on their own, and good on them, but this would make it statewide. And then we have a couple bills coming up in House elections. You've been calling the House Elections Committee. There are 2 bills up, one to support, which would, Senate Bill 1018, would enfranchise voters. So it helps voters and makes our elections more secure by creating an opportunity to cure errors on mail-in ballots. So if you were one of the, and it's a very low number, if you were one of the dozens of people who mess up and forget to sign it, or there's some other little clerical error on the ballot, the county would provide you notice of this, and you could run down to the county with your ID and say, I am this person, let's fix it, and they would fix it. This is a good thing for the voter. It's also a good thing for security, because all those questionable ballots get referred to the Attorney General's office for investigation. And it would reduce that number that investigators would have to look at. It gets the dolphins out of the tuna net, so to speak. We are also opposing in that committee, also up on Thursday, Senate Bill 1340. This bill we talked about on the Senate side. We're talking about it again on the House side. It would centralize voter registration with the Secretary of State's office and would require more frequent voter purges to occur. And then the process for challenging those purges would be centralized at the Secretary of State's office as well. I would just remind everybody the Secretary of State's office did not do a very good job in 2019, where they tried to purge a bunch of people they said were not citizens. It was 100,000, almost 100,000 people who they said were not citizens, and they were citizens. They were absolutely citizens. They were using bad, flawed data from the Department of Public Safety. And so somebody had gotten their driver's license when they weren't a citizen, subsequently became a citizen, and then registered to vote. Nothing wrong with that. Secretary of State's office botched it and tried to disenfranchise them. And it was only because county said, wait a minute, this is wrong. Your data is bad, and went to court, as I recall, that it was stopped. Nevertheless, we're trying to centralize more and more of this voter registration with the Secretary of State's office, which is not the proper venue for this. And then lastly, we talked about this in the legislative update. There's Senate Bill 3 and Senate Bill 1278. These 2 bills are sitting in the House State Affairs Committee. These are the bills that attack renewable power, blame it for the blackout, scapegoat it, frankly, for the blackout, and would subsidize the oil and gas industry while financially penalizing renewable power. we need these bills to just stop and die in the House State Affairs Committee. And we need calls to the State Affairs Committee to encourage them to do that. And that is the action alert for the week.
Right. So a couple quick questions before we get to those, Josh. Again, 90% of those bills are in House calendars. When people make those telephone calls to members of the calendars committee, is it really just about like, here's my list of opposed and here's my list of support?
I would think that. Yeah. Don't try to explain all those. You saw how long it took me. The staff will not be receptive. They'll cut you off. And I don't blame them. The volume of it. So run through your list. They keep a tally. It's more about hearing about these things over and over again to try to encourage them to exercise their authority to keep these things in committee. So run through your list and run through it as quickly as possible.
All right, I'm going to let you get back to it, but on House Bill 4331, does that only apply to nonprofits or apply to all organizations, for example, assisted living facilities that help their residents or other facilities?
Yeah, it applies to everybody. It's a very broadly written statute in addition to being very vaguely written. We think it has several constitutional problems, but we would prefer not to have to fight about that in court. Yeah, it would apply to everybody. I'm trying to explain how it applies to you, churches, our membership, but it applies to political parties. It applies to any third-party actor.
All right, Josh, a lot of work going on. Do you want to echo the sentiment that it's really important that folks make their telephone calls and have their meetings over the course of the next 34 days?
Yeah, I do. The next 2 weeks are critical. And while it looks bleak, it is not over. One of my favorite movies is The Untouchables. It's from the 90s. It's about Elliot Ness and Al Capone, and it's got a young Kevin Costner, and and I forget who's playing. Anyway, I think it's De Niro, but it could be Pacino. It's De Niro playing Al Capone. And in that movie, there's a moment where Elliot Ness is behind in the game, so to speak, and Al Capone's talking trash to him, and he says, "Never stop till the fight is finished." And at the end of the movie, when Capone is eventually convicted, much to Capone's surprise, because Capone thought he had rigged the jury and Elliot Ness had not stopped fighting, even in court, to get the jury switched out. The very end of the game, Capone is surprised by his conviction. And Elliot Ness looks at him and says, never stop till the fight's finished. Don't stop. Nothing's done yet.
I would encourage everybody to fact check Josh on those actors and let him know by tweeting at him whether he got that right or not. So that's your homework assignment in addition to the telephone calls. All right, Josh, really appreciate the time today. I know it's a busy week for you. And so thanks for your work in the Capitol and for keeping us all up to speed. Friends, you can support the work by making sure that you are signed up for Texas Impact opportunities. Make sure you're signed up for the rapid response team so you can receive updates to this action alert throughout the week and emails when it's important to hold your specific member accountable or make calls specifically to them. I've mentioned we'll have some rapid response notifications going out to certain districts this afternoon if you're watching live. You can also join the legislative engagement group to be connected with other advocates in your legislative district. And I'd also encourage y'all just on the voting piece to go to everyvotetx.org, make sure that you and your congregations have signed the statement to make it clear that as a person of faith, you oppose these efforts to suppress the votes. And finally, remember that if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members. You can do that by going to texasimpact.org/join. And friends, as I said at the top, and as Josh just echoed, the next few weeks are going to be critical. We have to do this work to the best of our ability. We have to keep fighting for the next 34 days. And then, as I said at the beginning, we'll give you a couple weeks off before we jump back in to start doing the long-term work that's going to be necessary to work for a more just and equitable Texas. So it's important that you do this work, but it's even more important that you get some friends to join you in this long-term work for democracy. So with that, let's get to work.